The morning sun hadn't fully risen when Marcus Chen walked through Central Park's entrance. His old backpack was heavy with art supplies, and his winter jacket had a small hole in the right pocket. It was 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday in October, and the park was quiet except for a few early morning joggers. Marcus was 28 years old, but the dark circles under his eyes made him look older. 3 years ago, he had dropped out of art school with just one semester left. The memory of that decision still bothered him, but his family's financial problems had left him no choice. Finding his usual spot near the fountain, Marcus began his daily routine. First, he pulled out his wooden easel, the one he had bought second-hand 2 years ago. Its legs were scratched, and one was slightly shorter than the others, but he fixed that with a folded piece of cardboard. Next came his canvas, not the expensive kind he used to buy in art school, but a cheaper version that still did the job. Another day, another dollar, he whispered to himself, placing his old baseball hat on the ground. The hat had become his tip jar, though most days it collected more fallen leaves than money. As he set up his paints, Marcus checked his phone. 3 missed calls from his landlord reminded him of the reality he was trying to forget. He was 3 months behind on rent. His small apartment above the noisy Chinese restaurant wasn't much, but it was all he could afford, and now he might lose even that. The morning grew brighter, and more people entered the park. A group of elderly ladies power-walked past him, their colorful exercise clothes bringing a small smile to his face. He had painted them before. They were here every Tuesday and Thursday, rain or shine. Marcus started with light pencil strokes on his canvas, outlining the scene before him. The fountain, the trees starting to show their fall colors, and the bench where an old man always fed pigeons. These were the details that made the park come alive in his paintings. His hands moved quickly but carefully. Years of practice had taught him how to capture the important details. The way light hit the water, how shadows fell across the path, the different ways people walked when they were happy or sad or in a hurry. A young couple stopped to watch him work. The girl smiled and pointed at his painting, but they walked away without dropping any money in his hat. Marcus was used to this. People liked to watch artists work, but few wanted to pay for art these days. By mid-morning, his first painting was finished. A peaceful scene of the park waking up. It showed joggers in the distance, morning light through the trees, and the fountain spraying water into the cool autumn air. It was good work, maybe some of his best, but experience had taught him that good work didn't always mean good sales. Marcus checked his wallet while eating the sandwich he had packed, $2.35. His phone bill was overdue, and the art supply store had already warned him about his credit limit. The gallery applications he had sent out last month, 15 of them, all came back with polite rejections. Some didn't bother responding at all. Still, he kept painting. The afternoon brought a new canvas and new scenes to capture. Children playing after school, office workers eating late lunches on benches, dogs chasing squirrels. Marcus painted them all. His fingers were stained with different colors, and his back ached from standing all day, but he didn't stop. As the sun began to set, Marcus counted the day's earnings. $27 and some change. Not enough for rent, barely enough for dinner and tomorrow's art supplies. He carefully packed his paintings, 3 completed works that would join the others stacked in his small apartment. Walking home, Marcus passed the expensive art galleries on Fifth Avenue. Their windows showed paintings that sold for thousands of dollars. Sometimes he imagined his work hanging there, but dreams didn't pay bills. Still, as he walked home in the growing darkness, Marcus knew he would be back tomorrow, because even if no one else believed in his art, he still did. The day ended as it began, with Marcus Chen carrying his heavy backpack, his dreams, and his determination. Tomorrow would be another day in the park, another chance to create something beautiful, another opportunity for someone to notice his talent. For now, that had to be enough. Marcus Chen walked up the creaky stairs to his third-floor apartment, his legs heavy after another long day in the park. The smell of Chinese food from the restaurant below filled the narrow stairway. Any other day, the smell might have made him hungry. Today, it just made his stomach turn. Opening his apartment door, he found what he had been dreading, a bright orange envelope on his floor. Someone had slipped it under his door while he was gone. Marcus didn't need to open it to know what it was, but he did anyway. His hands shook as he read the words. Evitation notice 7280 URS to VACATE. The small studio apartment was barely big enough for a bed and his art supplies, but it had been his home for the past 2 years. Paint stains marked the wooden floor, and finished paintings lined the walls. It wasn't much, but it was his space to create, to dream, to live. Marcus sat on his bed and opened his phone's banking app. The numbers were worse than he expected. $127.83 in his checking account. His rent was $1,200, and he was already 3 months behind. The math was simple and cruel. He needed $3,600 to keep his home, and he had less than $130. His eyes moved to the wooden box on his small table. Inside were his best brushes, a graduation gift from his grandmother before she passed away. They were professional quality, worth at least $500 if he sold them. He had promised himself he would never sell them, but promises didn't pay rent. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he whispered, touching the soft bristles of his favorite brush. She had believed in him more than anyone else. On her deathbed, she had made him promise to never give up on his art. But what would she say now, seeing him like this? Marcus walked to his kitchen area, really just a mini fridge and a microwave on a small counter. Pinned to the wall were 15 rejection letters from art galleries. He had applied to every gallery in his price range, sending them pictures of his best work. Some said his art was not what they were looking for. Others said they were not accepting new artists at this time. A few hadn't bothered to reply at all. His phone buzzed. Another text from his mother. "Son, the accounting job is still open. Mr. Lee would hire you tomorrow. Please think about it." Marcus hadn't told his parents about the eviction notice yet. They had worked so hard, running their small grocery store 7 days a week, trying to give him a better life. How could he tell them he was about to be homeless? Looking out his small window, Marcus could see the tops of the trees in Central Park. Tomorrow would be Thursday, usually a good day for sales because of the tourists. But even if he sold everything he painted, it wouldn't be enough. Not anymore. Marcus opened his art supply box and counted what he had left: 3 canvases, half-empty tubes of paint, and his grandmother's brushes. The art supply store had already told him his credit was maxed out. He couldn't buy more supplies even if he wanted to. The night grew darker, and Marcus's apartment got colder. The heating in the building never worked well, but he couldn't complain. Not when he hadn't paid rent in 3 months. He wrapped himself in his only blanket and looked at his latest painting from the park. It showed children playing near the fountain, their faces full of joy and freedom. He had priced it at $75, but no one had even asked about buying it. Taking out a piece of paper, Marcus began to write. Things to do tomorrow. 1. Pack important stuff. 2. Sell brushes. 3. Call Mr. Lee about a counting job. 4. One last day painting in the park. His hand shook as he wrote the last line. One last day. After tomorrow, he would have to be practical. Get a real job. Be responsible. His dream of being an artist would have to wait, maybe forever. As Marcus finally lay down to sleep, his grandmother's brushes still in their box, he made a decision. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow would be his last day as the park painter. Tomorrow, he would say goodbye to his dream, unless some miracle happened. But Marcus Chen had stopped believing in miracles a long time ago. The next morning was colder than usual. Marcus arrived at his spot in Central Park earlier than normal, knowing it was his last day. His hands were stiff from the cold as he set up his easel. Today, he had brought his grandmother's brushes. If he had to sell them later, he wanted to use them one last time. At 6:45 a.m., the park was quiet except for a few dedicated joggers. Marcus chose his spot carefully, setting up near the old stone bridge where the morning light was always perfect. He had saved his best canvas for today, determined to create something special for his final painting. As he started working, Marcus noticed an elderly woman sitting on a nearby bench. She came every morning to feed the pigeons, throwing breadcrumbs while talking softly to the birds. Something about her peaceful face and gentle movements caught his attention. Without thinking twice, Marcus began to paint her. He worked quickly but carefully, using his grandmother's brushes to capture every detail. The way the woman's silver hair caught the morning light, how her wrinkled hands gently scattered the breadcrumbs, the soft smile on her face as she watched the pigeons gather around her feet. Marcus was so focused on his painting that he didn't notice someone had stopped behind him. James Wilson, dressed in expensive running gear and carrying a water bottle, had been watching him work for the past 15 minutes. James wasn't like the usual park visitors. His custom-made running shoes and high-end smartwatch showed he belonged to a different world. At 45 years old, James had built his technology company from nothing, turning it into a billion-dollar business. His morning runs through Central Park were his way of staying connected to the real world, away from business meetings and boardrooms. Something about Marcus's painting had made James stop his run. He watched as the young artist mixed colors with expert hands, how he looked back and forth between his subject and the canvas, capturing not just what the woman looked like, but who she was. The morning grew brighter, and more people entered the park. Some passed by quickly, while others paused briefly to watch Marcus work. But James stayed, moving only slightly to keep his shadow from falling on the canvas. He noticed the holes in Marcus's shoes, the worn-out jacket, and the nearly empty tip hat on the ground. Marcus continued painting, unaware of his important observer. He added final touches to the woman's face, capturing the kindness in her eyes and the peaceful expression she wore while feeding her birds. The painting was coming alive under his skilled hands, becoming more than just a picture, it was becoming a story. James checked his expensive watch. He had been standing there for 30 minutes now, missing 2 important phone calls, but he couldn't walk away. There was something familiar in the way Marcus worked, something that reminded him of himself 20 years ago, that same hunger, that same dedication to doing something perfectly even when no one was watching. The elderly woman finally got up from her bench, her bag of breadcrumbs empty. She walked past Marcus without noticing her portrait, disappearing down the park path. But her image remained on the canvas, captured forever in soft morning light, surrounded by her beloved pigeons. Marcus stepped back from his easel, studying his work with critical eyes. It was good, maybe one of his best. The morning light, the gentle scene, the feeling of peace. He had captured it all. For a moment, he forgot about his problems, lost in the satisfaction of creating something beautiful. James moved closer, his expensive running shoes crunching on the gravel path. He looked at the painting, then at Marcus's worn-out art supplies, then at the nearly empty tip hat. In his mind, a plan was forming, one that would change both their lives. But Marcus still hadn't noticed him. He was too busy adding the final touches to his painting, using his grandmother's finest brush to perfect the smallest details. It was only when James cleared his throat that Marcus realized someone was standing behind him. He turned around, expecting another curious tourist. Instead, he found himself looking at a man whose presence seemed to command attention, even in simple running clothes. Neither of them knew it yet, but this moment would mark the beginning of something extraordinary. Marcus turned around slowly, his paintbrush still in hand. The man standing before him was tall, dressed in expensive running gear that probably cost more than Marcus's monthly rent. James Wilson smiled, but Marcus noticed his eyes were still studying the painting carefully. "How long did it take you to learn to paint like this?" James asked, his voice friendly but direct. Marcus wiped his hands on his old jeans, leaving small streaks of paint. "I've been painting since I was 10, he answered. "But I learned the real techniques in art school, before I had to drop out." James nodded, walking around the easel to get a better view. "Tell me about art school. Why did you leave?" Something about James's genuine interest made Marcus open up. "My parents run a small grocery store in Queens. They saved for years to send me to art school, but in my final semester, the store almost went bankrupt. They needed help with the bills, so..." Marcus shrugged, letting the unfinished sentence hang in the cold morning air. "So you chose family over your degree," James finished for him. He looked at Marcus's other paintings leaning against a nearby tree. "May I?" Marcus nodded, and James carefully looked through each painting. There were 5 of them, scenes from the park, each showing different moments of city life. A young couple sharing a coffee on a bench, children flying kites, an old man reading a newspaper in the morning sun. "Your technique is excellent," James said. "But what really stands out is how you capture people. These aren't just paintings of the park, they're stories about the people in it." Marcus felt his face grow warm at the compliment. "That's what I try to do. Everyone who comes to this park has a story. I just try to tell it through my paintings." James picked up one of the paintings, one of the couple sharing coffee. "How much?" Marcus hesitated. His usual prices seemed too low for someone like James, but he was afraid to ask for more. "That one's $75, he said finally. James looked at him for a long moment. "And how many do you usually sell in a day?" "On a good day, maybe 1 or 2. Some days, none." Marcus glanced at his nearly empty tip hat, Today hasn't been a good day. James set the painting down carefully and looked at Marcus's art supplies. His eyes lingered on the wooden box containing the special brushes. Those brushes are professional grade. Kolinsky sable, aren't they? Marcus was surprised that James knew about art supplies. Yes, they were my grandmother's. She gave them to me before she passed away. And you're still using them, even though they must be worth hundreds of dollars? James asked. Marcus touched the wooden box protectively. They're the last gift she gave me. But, he paused, thinking about the eviction notice waiting in his apartment. But I might have to sell them soon. James was quiet for a moment, looking back at the painting of the elderly woman feeding pigeons. You know, Marcus, there are two types of artists in this world. Those who do it for money, and those who do it because they have no choice. It's who they are. He turned to face Marcus. Which type are you? Marcus thought about the question. He thought about his parents' grocery store, about his grandmother's brushes, about the eviction notice. Even if I never sold another painting, he said slowly, I'd still need to paint. It's like breathing for me. James smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. He pulled out his phone, checked something quickly, then looked back at Marcus. I have a proposition for you, but first, I'd like to hear more about your journey. Would you join me for coffee? There's a cafe just outside the park. Marcus looked at his paintings, his supplies spread out on the ground. I need to stay here. Try to make some sales. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek wallet. I'll buy all of these paintings, right now. Then you can pack up and join me for coffee. What do you say? Marcus stared at him, not quite believing what he was hearing. This had to be a dream or a joke. But James was already counting out crisp $100 bills, far more than Marcus's asking price for all the paintings combined. The morning sun was higher now, making the frost on the grass sparkle like tiny diamonds. In that moment, standing in the park where he thought he would say goodbye to his dreams, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. 20 minutes later, Marcus sat across from James Wilson in a fancy cafe near Central Park. His worn jacket and paint-stained jeans looked out of place among the well-dressed morning customers. The coffee in front of him cost more than he usually spent on breakfast and lunch combined. My wife Sarah, James said, showing Marcus a picture on his phone, runs the Wilson Gallery on Madison Avenue. Marcus nearly choked on his coffee. The Wilson Gallery was one of the most exclusive art spaces in New York. Even getting inside to look at the paintings was difficult. Yesterday, James continued, stirring his coffee, we had to cancel an exhibition because the artist couldn't deliver his work on time. This has left us with an empty gallery space in 6 months. He looked directly at Marcus. I want to offer you that space. Marcus set his coffee cup down carefully, sure he had misheard. You want me to exhibit at the Wilson Gallery? James nodded. A solo exhibition. 30 pieces minimum. All new work. He pulled out a small notebook and pen, but there are conditions. Marcus listened as James listed them. First, you'll need a proper studio. I have a space above the gallery that's currently empty. It's yours to use. Second, you'll work with Sarah. She's one of the best curators in New York. She'll help guide your work. Third, you'll need to commit to this full-time. No more part paintings for quick sales. Fourth, you'll have deadlines. This isn't just about creating art. It's about learning to be a professional artist. Marcus's head was spinning. Mr. Wilson, James, he corrected. Call me James. James. Marcus started again. This is incredible, but I can't. I'm being evicted from my apartment. I have no money for supplies. I can barely afford food right now. James smiled. That's part of the deal, too. He wrote down a number on his notebook and slid it across the table. Marcus's eyes widened at the figure. It was more money than he ever seen. That's your monthly stipend, James explained. It covers rent for a small apartment, art supplies, and living expenses. Plus, you'll get 70% of all sales from the exhibition. The standard gallery cut is 50%, but Sarah and I believe in investing in new artists. Marcus stared at the number on the paper. It was enough to solve all his immediate problems, but something bothered him. Why me? Why today? There are hundreds of artists in New York looking for chances like this. James was quiet for a moment, looking out the cafe window at the park where they'd met. 25 years ago, I was working out of my garage, trying to start a tech company. Everyone said I was wasting my time. Then one day, a stranger saw something in me that I couldn't even see in myself. He invested in my company, became my mentor. Today, that company is worth billions. He turned back to Marcus. But this isn't charity. I saw your work. The way you capture people, moments, emotions, it's special. Sarah will see it too. We're not giving you anything. We're investing in your talent. Marcus touched his grandmother's brush in his pocket. What if I fail? What if I can't create 30 gallery quality pieces in 6 months? Then you fail? James said simply. But you'll fail trying something big instead of failing slowly in the park day after day. He pulled out a business card and placed it next to the notebook. The choice is yours. Sleep on it. Call me tomorrow with your decision. Standing up, James put on his expensive running jacket. Oh, and Marcus? Those paintings I bought? I'm donating them to a children's hospital. Art shouldn't just be for people who can afford to buy it. He smiled one last time and left the cafe. Marcus sat there for a long time, staring at the business card and the number on the notebook. Through the window, he could see his usual spot in the park. Just 2 hours ago, he thought today would be his last day as an artist. Now, his phone buzzed, another text from his mother about the accounting job. Marcus looked at James's business card again, then at his mother's text. Two paths lay before him, safety or risk, security or dreams, giving up or going all in. Outside, the morning sun made the frost glitter on the park grass. Somewhere in the city, his paintings were heading to a children's hospital. And in his pocket, his grandmother's brushes seemed to be waiting for his decision. 2 months had passed since that morning in the cafe. Marcus stood in his new studio above the Wilson Gallery, surrounded by half-finished paintings and blank canvases. The space was bigger than his old apartment, with large windows that let in natural light and a view of Madison Avenue below. His life had changed completely. The first thing James had done was pay off Marcus's old landlord and help him find a small but clean apartment near the gallery. Marcus's parents had cried when he showed them his new studio, not from sadness, but from joy at seeing their son's dreams coming true. But the path wasn't easy. Sarah Wilson, James's wife and the gallery's curator, was as demanding as she was talented. She stood in the studio now, examining Marcus's latest work with critical eyes. The technique is good, Sarah said, studying a large canvas showing a group of children playing in Central Park's snow. But something's missing. She was elegant and sophisticated, but her honest feedback always helped Marcus improve. Marcus knew she was right. Even though he was using the best materials now, professional canvases, high-quality paints, and proper lighting, some of his recent paintings felt different from the ones he'd made in the park. You're thinking too much, Sarah said, walking around the studio. When I saw your park paintings, they had raw emotion. Now you're trying to paint what you think a gallery wants. She stopped in front of his earliest park paintings, which they'd hung on the wall for inspiration. Remember who you are, Marcus. You're not just painting scenes. You're telling stories. Marcus looked at his old park paintings. She was right. Back then, he hadn't worried about gallery standards or art critics. He had simply painted what he felt, what he saw in people's faces and movements. Take tomorrow off, Sarah suggested. Go back to the park. Don't paint, just watch. Remember why you started doing this. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He had completed 15 paintings for the exhibition, halfway to his goal, but Sarah's words bothered him. Getting up, he went to his small kitchen and made coffee, something he could afford now without worrying about the cost. His phone showed a text from James. How's the work going? James checked on him regularly, not just about art but about life in general. He had become more than a sponsor. He was a mentor, teaching Marcus about the business side of art, how to talk to collectors, how to price his work. Marcus looked at his calendar. 3 months until the exhibition. 15 more paintings to create. The deadline that had once seemed far away now felt too close. The pressure to succeed, to prove James and Sarah right about him, was growing heavier each day. The next morning, following Sarah's advice, Marcus went back to Central Park. He found his old spot near the fountain, but instead of setting up an easel, he just sat on a bench and watched. The elderly women power walking, children playing, couples holding hands, all the scenes he used to paint. An old man approached, one who used to watch him paint every morning. "No painting today?" he asked, sitting next to Marcus. "Just watching," Marcus replied. "Sometimes I forget to do that." The old man smiled. "You know what I liked about your paintings? You saw people. Really saw them. Not just their faces, but their stories." Marcus thought about those words all day. That evening, back in his studio, he looked at his recent work with new eyes. The paintings were technically better than his park work. The colors more precise, the compositions more balanced. But something was different. Taking out a fresh canvas, Marcus closed his eyes and remembered the feeling of painting in the park, the excitement of capturing a perfect moment, the joy of telling someone's story through his art. Opening his eyes, he began to paint. Hours passed, the sun set and rose again, but Marcus didn't notice. When Sarah came for her daily visit, she found him still working, his clothes splattered with paint. She looked at the new painting, a scene showing the old man on the park bench, his face filled with wisdom and kindness. Sarah smiled. "Now that," she said softly, "is the Marcus Chen I saw in the park." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt like himself again. He wasn't just an artist with a gallery exhibition anymore. He was the park painter, telling stories through his brushstrokes, one canvas at a time. The evening of the exhibition opening arrived faster than Marcus could have imagined. He stood in the Wilson Gallery, wearing a new suit James had helped him choose. The space that had once seemed impossibly grand now held 30 of his paintings, each one telling a different story of New York life. 10 minutes until the doors open, Sarah announced, adjusting one of the spotlights. The gallery looked perfect. His paintings hung on clean white walls, each piece carefully lit to bring out its best features. Small cards beside each painting showed its title and price, numbers that still made Marcus's head spin. Marcus walked through the gallery one last time, remembering the story behind each painting. There was the elderly woman feeding pigeons, the painting that had caught James's attention that fateful morning. Next to it hung the children playing in the snow, the piece that had helped him find his style again. Each painting was a moment, a memory, a piece of his journey. Nervous? James appeared beside him, wearing an expensive suit but the same friendly smile. Terrified, Marcus admitted, adjusting his tie for the 100th time. His parents would be arriving soon, along with all the important art collectors and critics Sarah had invited. Even his old art school professors were coming. "Good," James said. "Being nervous means you care. But remember, you've earned this moment. Every painting in this room proves it." The gallery doors opened at exactly 7:00 p.m. People began flowing in, elegant women in evening dresses, men in expensive suits, art critics with their notepads. Marcus's parents arrived, his mother crying when she saw his name in large letters on the gallery wall. "Unseen New York, by him out RCUSCHEN." Marcus watched as people moved from painting to painting. He heard their comments, saw their reactions. A woman stood for a long time in front of his painting of an old couple dancing in the park. "It's like you can hear the music they're dancing to," she said to her friend. Art critics walked slowly, making notes. One stopped at his painting of children flying kites and smiled, something Sarah said critics rarely did. Another spent several minutes studying his brushwork on a scene showing morning joggers in the mist. Then Marcus saw them, the people from his paintings, the elderly women who power walked every morning, the old man who used to watch him paint, the couple who shared coffee on the park bench. Sarah had found them all and invited them to the opening. "The artist himself," Sarah said proudly, introducing Marcus to a group of collectors. "Marcus can tell you about his inspiration for these pieces." As Marcus talked about his work, he felt his nervousness fade. These paintings weren't just art on walls. They were stories he had lived, moments he had shared with the city and its people. Talking about them felt as natural as creating them. A first red dot, marking a sole painting, appeared beside the pigeon lady painting 30 minutes into the show. Then another, and another. Sarah moved through the gallery, placing red dots beside more paintings as buyers made their decisions. James stood near the entrance, watching it all with a satisfied smile. His phone buzzed, messages from other gallery owners asking about Marcus's future work. The art critics were already writing their reviews on their phones, unable to wait until morning. Marcus's father, who had once worried about his son's choice to be an artist, now stood proudly telling anyone who would listen, "That's my son's work. He painted those." His mother couldn't stop wiping tears from her eyes, especially when she saw the painting Marcus had done of their small grocery store. Near the end of the evening, a young art student approached Marcus. "I see you painting in the park sometimes," she said shyly. "Your work made me believe I could be an artist too." As the night went on, more red dots appeared beside the paintings. Sarah's assistant kept track of the sales, her eyes growing wider with each transaction. But for Marcus, the real success wasn't in the red dots or the prices. It was in the way people connected with his work. The final painting to sell was the one he'd made of the old man on the park bench, the piece that had helped him find his voice again. The buyer, a major museum curator, asked Marcus to sign the back of the canvas. As Marcus signed his name, he remembered that morning 6 months ago when he thought he would have to give up his dream. Now, standing in a prestigious gallery surrounded by his work and people who believed in it, he realized that sometimes the end of one dream is just the beginning of a bigger one. 1 year had passed since Marcus Chen's first exhibition at the Wilson Gallery. On a bright spring morning, he stood in front of a small building in Queens, holding a set of new keys. Above the door hung a freshly painted sign, Chen Community Art Center. Using the money from his successful exhibition and help from James, Marcus had bought this old warehouse and transformed it into an art center. The space inside was bright and open, with large windows letting in natural light. Easels stood in neat rows, waiting for the day's first class. "Ready for the grand opening?" James asked, walking up beside him. Over the past year, James had become more than a mentor. He was family. He had helped Marcus plan this center, teaching him about business loans, permits, and management. Almost, Marcus smiled, adjusting one of the many paintings on the walls. These weren't for sale, they were his park paintings, hung to inspire others. The famous Pigeon Lady painting held the center spot, reminding him of where his journey began. At 9:00 a.m., people started arriving, but these weren't wealthy art collectors or critics. They were neighborhood kids, elderly residents, and working people who loved art but could never afford classes. Marcus had made sure his center's prices were low enough for everyone. "Welcome to our first free weekend class," Marcus announced to the group. He looked at their faces, excited children holding cheap brushes, teenagers trying to look cool but clearly interested, adults who had always wanted to learn but never had the chance. Sarah Wilson arrived with art supplies, a donation from her gallery. "Every artist needs good tools," she said, handing out professional quality brushes and paints to the surprised students. Marcus noticed some kids holding their brushes the same way he had held his grandmother's brushes, carefully, like precious treasures. The morning class was for beginners. Marcus taught them basic techniques, the same ones he had learned years ago. "Art isn't about being perfect," he told them, helping a young girl mix colors. "It's about telling your story." During lunch break, his parents arrived with food from their grocery store, now doing well thanks to Marcus's help. His mother cried again. She cried at all his big moments, when she saw local families learning art in a space her son had created. In the afternoon, Marcus took his advanced class to Central Park, back to his old spot near the fountain. But this time, he wasn't alone. 20 students set up their easels around him, each finding their own scene to paint. "Remember," he told them, "look for the stories. Everyone in this park has one." He watched as his students began to work, each bringing their own view of the world to their canvases. The old man who used to watch Marcus paint walked by, now using a cane. He stopped to look at all the artists painting in Marcus's old spot. "You've started something beautiful," he said, his eyes twinkling. Later that day, back at the center, Marcus hung his students' first paintings on a special wall. They weren't perfect. Some colors were mixed wrong, some proportions were off, but each painting had heart, just like his early park paintings. James and Sarah stayed until closing time, helping clean brushes and arrange easels for tomorrow's classes. "You know," James said, looking around the center, "this is better than any gallery exhibition." Marcus agreed. His paintings now sold for high prices, and galleries across the city wanted to show his work. But here, in this simple art center in Queens, he felt most successful. He was giving others the chance his grandmother had given him with those special brushes. That evening, after everyone had left, Marcus sat alone in the center. On his desk was a framed photo of his grandmother and her brushes, the ones he'd almost sold a year ago. Next to it lay his calendar, full of class schedules and community art projects. His phone buzzed with a message from a famous gallery wanting to show his work. Marcus smiled and put the phone away. He would answer tomorrow. Right now, he wanted to enjoy this moment. Through the windows, he could see the sun setting over Queens. Children played on the street where he grew up, some carrying paintings they'd made in his class. On the walls, 30 new artists had shared their first works. Marcus Chen, the park painter who had almost given up his dreams, had found something better than success. He had found a way to help others find theirs. And somewhere, he knew, his grandmother was smiling.